Well, today we're carrying on looking through the book of Matthew, at the genesis of Jesus, as Matthew introduces that book to us. And to start off, I'm going to share a story of something that happened to me when I was at college. I was doing a student placement with a pastor here in Christchurch, and he lived over the other side of the city. I'd never really had much to do with that side of town, so I didn't know where it was, but he gave me his address. And I had this brand new thing that it had just come out. It was a Galaxy S1, a smartphone, my first smartphone. I was awesome. I was super excited because it had this thing, a GPS, where you could navigate. You didn't need maps anymore, so I didn't have a map in my car anymore, because why would I need one? I've got this new smartphone. And so I put his address in and I started driving. And part way through the journey, I heard something. My GPS told me something that really worried me. It said, GPS signal lost. And when that happened, my face looked very much like that. Okay, I was driving to this guy's house. I didn't know where it was, but I had this thing that I had trusted to lead me there. And partway through the journey, it said GPS signal lost. And I was without guidance. I had nothing left to lead me. I didn't know where I was going. Thankfully for me, by that time I was already on the motorway. And I knew I had to drive along it for a little bit before I got off. I didn't know where I was getting off, but I knew it was up ahead a wee bit. And so I just prayed and hoped that it would reconnect again. And thankfully, it did. I got another message that the GPS signal was reestablished, and it kept giving me directions. And when that happened, I rejoiced. I was happy. I wasn't going to be lost. I was able to continue to navigate to where I was going. Now, we're going to look at a similar sort of story today. When we look at the story in Matthew chapter 2 with the wise man. In Matthew chapter 2, starting in verse 1 and 2. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. So the wise men here turn up in Jerusalem. They say, we have seen his star in the east. And they followed the star, and it was guiding them in their journey to the east. But now that they've got to Israel, they're having to come and ask for directions. It's because the star had led them this far, but then it disappeared. You know, they had their own GPS signal lost experience. And I often wonder, you know, what was going through their heads when this happened, because when it happened to me, I sort of knew what was to blame for it. One, I got rid of my map because I didn't think I needed it. But two, this technology that was supposedly really awesome was still kind of new, and it didn't always work. So it was very clear where the faults was. But for the wise men, they'd been following God's leading. Every night they looked up and they saw that star, and they knew God was leading them. But then his stars disappeared, and they'd be left in that situation where they're asking the question, why did it go? Why has God taken away his guiding star? And I think that left them in this situation where they don't know why it's gone. They don't know what's gone wrong, or has something gone wrong. But they don't lose hope. They carry on. And they come to Jerusalem to ask about where is the Messiah. And as we go through, Herod calls the priests and they give him the answer. They tell him, you know, he was born in Bethlehem. And then when they leave, if we jump down to verse 9, we read this. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. As soon as their GPS signal was established, they rejoiced. The star was back. It was leading them again. But this again begs the question, why did the star disappear? Because as soon as they left Jerusalem, if God was going to bring that star back to guide them again, then why do they need to go to ask for directions? Because it wasn't to guide them, because God continued guiding them as soon as they left. And so why did this star disappear from in this part of their journey? And I think one of the key things that reveals this to us is what was the response in Jerusalem when they got there. As you read here, that they turned up asking this question. And we carry on reading. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when they had gathered all the chief priests and the scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And so the result of the wise men going to ask for the directions was not so they would know where to go, but so Herod, all of Jerusalem, and the chief priests and the scribes would have this witness that Christ was born, that the King of the Jews was here now. And it's not insignificant that we read all of Jerusalem was in a stir at their arrival and at their announcement. Jerusalem, the heart of Israel, where 3 times a year all the Jews would come to worship God. All of Jerusalem knew this had happened. And by the time the next major feast came, all of Israel would know that this had happened. God wasn't just leading the wise men to come to worship Christ. He was leading the wise men to come and bear witness to his people that Christ was born, that the King had come. And so when I just think of looking at this from the point of view of the wise men, they're journeying. And we're going to see it was a 2-year journey that they were going on. Every night for 2 years, they were looking up in the sky and they saw the star guiding them every night for 2 years. And then right as they were at the end of their journey, just before they reached their destination, God's guidance disappeared. And that leads me to question, from their point of view, I would imagine it was very confusing and troubling. And the question is, why has God led us this whole way just to abandon us now when the end is in sight? It's only maybe a couple of extra days, a week or two to get where they needed to go. But God stopped leading them just before they were going to arrive at their destination. And from their point of view, this doesn't make sense. But when we look from heaven's point of view, God actually was leading them there to witness to all of his people. And if God hadn't have taken away that star, if God had have led them right to Jesus, they would have journeyed for 2 years, come across, gone to Jesus, worshipped him, and gone home, and God's people would have been none the wiser. But God wanted them to bear witness, to bear a testimony that they have come to worship Christ. And by taking away that star, it's a little bit ironic, but by taking away God's leading was the way that he led them to do his will. By taking that star away, they were led to ask the questions. People got the witness. And then as soon as they left, that star came back. It appeared to them that God had taken away his leading. It appeared to them that God had abandoned them, that God had left them. But that's only because God saw that that was the best way to lead them, to get them to do what he wanted. And I imagine this is one of those things that the wise man, years after, when they got back to their own country, still sit there and talk about how strange it was that the star just disappeared and then came back again, and not understanding why that happened. And it's not going to be till they get to heaven that they get to look back on it and they have one of those, oh, now I understand moments. Because in this whole story, it's never explained to them why it happened. They don't get to see the result of this. From their point of view, it doesn't make sense. But all God asks of them is to carry on, to not give up. When the star disappeared, all God wanted was to carry on, was to keep searching, was to go and ask the questions, was to go and keep searching for him. So when it looked like God had abandoned them, all he wanted them was to keep trusting in the journey that he had called them to go on. And it's interesting, we see the same thing in the book of Job, for example. Job was going through these sufferings and he didn't know why it was happening. And when God turns up to him, he doesn't actually explain to Job why it's happening. All he says to Job is, I handle this universe that is far bigger than you could understand. You know, look at creation. Look at how I laid the foundation. I did all this. I see this universe from a different point of view than you do. And I'm just asking you to trust me that I got this right. He's not asking us to understand why everything happens to us. He's asking us to trust God when we don't understand why these things are happening. When it looks like God had just abandoned Job to his suffering, or God had abandoned the wise man there. He's still asking them to carry on trusting who he is when we don't know why these things are happening. And we even see Christ going through a similar experience on the cross. In his sufferings, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? In his suffering, he cries out, it's like, looks with the feeling that God had abandoned him, not understanding why this is all happening. That suffering was so intense that he couldn't see through the portals of the grave. That suffering was so intense that it appeared to him that God had completely abandoned him. He didn't understand why this was happening. But the next thing he cries out is, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. When we don't understand why things are happening, God calls us just to follow him and trust that he understands. So with the wise man here, when it appeared that God had left them, that God had led them in this 2-year journey, and at the very end, taken away his guidance and left them, he wasn't asking them to understand why it happened. He just needed them to trust the calling that he had given them and to carry on searching for the Messiah. And in doing that, they will witness to God's people, to all of Jerusalem, and through that, all of Israel would know that the Messiah had come. Now, as I mentioned, it was the journey that they took. And we're going to look at the timing of the journey. We jump back to the beginning. So they came to Herod and they asked that question, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and they come to worship him. So they saw the star and they followed it. Okay, and Herod comes to them with this question in verse 7. Then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. So Herod wanted to know, when did you first see the star? Okay, how long was it since you've seen it and started following the star? And if we jump down to verse 16, we find the answer. It says, then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise man, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and in the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise man. So that tells us that when Herod went to them and asked them when they saw that star appear, it was 2 years. You know, so about 2 years, the wise men had seen this star. About 2 years they had been journeying to get there. And that's sort of quite a testimony to how far this prophecy about the Messiah had spread, that it took them a 2-year journey from their home to reach Israel. Now, we don't know where they came from, but if you're in Israel and you start journeying to the east 2 years, you can end up in India or China. So it's pretty much anywhere in the far reaches of that continent, these wise men had come to worship Christ. a 2-year journey. And it's interesting as well, when we look at how Christ is described here in verse 11, and when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him, and then they gave their gifts. But notice here, Jesus is not referred to as a baby anymore. He's now a young child. Like I said, they saw the star. They've been journeying for 2 years. Jesus is no longer a baby. He's a toddler. The Bible uses the word young child. This is in contrast to Luke. When the shepherds come, they came at his birth. In Luke, it says, "For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign to you. You shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling cloth and lying in a manger." So in Luke, the shepherds came when Christ was born. And when this happened, the star appeared in the sky at the birth of Christ. And that star is not like any other star in the sky. It didn't behave like any other star. The wise men were following the star. It was guiding them in the direction. And then the star disappeared from the sky, and then it reappeared. That this isn't a normal star. Okay, this is a special sign that God put in the sky just for those who are following the prophecy to know and to be led to the Messiah. And so by the time they got there, it was 2 years after this. Christ was now a toddler, and they came to worship him. Now, I want to actually spend a bit of time looking at the actual question of the wise man. When they came, they asked that question, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." And something I find very bold about this question is they're standing before Herod the king, and they're asking the current king of Israel, where is the real king of the Jews? The one who was born king, not the one who became king because his father gained favors with Julius Caesar and because he did all types of political maneuvering and all types of immoral and wicked things to seize control of power for himself. But they go to the current king and ask him, where is the real king, the one who deserves to be king, the one to whom the throne belongs, the one who is born king of the Jews? And that takes a lot of boldness and courage to ask a question like that. But it seems from these wise men that they're not even concerned about that. They're just coming, trusting the prophecy, trusting the guidance that they've had, and following where God is leading them. They're not worried about the consequences. They're not worried about what the king might do because they know they're following God. Consequences come what may, they are here to speak the truth and ask that question, where is he that is born King of the Jews? And one more point. The fact that it says that he's born King of the Jews is another interesting point to note, because in royal families, people aren't born the king. They're born a prince, and they become a king when they're old enough to inherit the throne. And when the previous king has passed on or abdicated, then they become a king. But you're not born a king, you're born a prince. But the fact that this one is born a king meant they understood the messianic nature of this. He's the prophesied once and future king. The throne is his from long before. All the other kings of Israel were just sort of, if you could say, keeping the seat warm for the one who it really belonged to. And that's the one who was born King of the Jews. Now, the question is, I've mentioned this a few times, they've been following this prophecy, but where did they get this from? Where did they get this understanding that if they followed the star that appeared, they would come to the Messiah, the one to worship as the King of the Jews? And we find that in Numbers 24 in the prophecy of Balaam. And we're going to look at this and compare the two. Here we read in Numbers 24, verse 17. Balaam is in this oracle is saying, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. Now, there's a couple of parts to this. First of all, he starts off, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. So here, Balaam is clearly speaking about this promised one that is to come. Okay, this promised future one that would come. And it describes him here as saying, a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Now, a scepter is, it's what the king holds to show his authority to rule. And so again, the promised one is the ruler that would arise out of Israel. And the rising of this ruler in Israel, this king in Israel, coincides with the coming of a star out of Jacob. And so when we put these two statements together, we see that when they're asking he that is born king of the Jews, they're asking about the promised one that is the ruler of Israel. And they're connecting the one born king of the Jews with the star that comes, which is right here. The star that comes is the ruler that shall arise. And so we see each part of their question reflects a part of Balaam's prophecy there. So somehow, when Balaam prophesied that, God preserved that scripture, that prophecy. And while God's people were going, around Canaan, worshipping idols, and then being taken into Babylon and being brought back, being ruled over by the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, somehow God had preserved this independent way over in the east, so that these wise men at the time, they could see the star and they knew the prophecy and they came to worship Christ. But there's another question that arises when we look at this prophecy, because we see this part here, and that clearly refers to Christ at his first coming. But when we carry on to read the prophecy, it talks about, the scepter shall rise out of Israel, and then it says, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Seth. And so it's destroying these nations. Now that's something that doesn't seem to fit with Christ's first coming here, but it carries on, and Edom shall be a possession. Seir also shall be a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion, and shall destroy him that remaineth of the cities. And so this first part seems to apply quite nicely to the first coming of Christ, to Christ coming as the Lamb, meek and lowly. But then it talks about him ruling as king, destroying the enemies, conquering the nations. And that seems to be disjointed from the first part of the prophecy, because we know when Christ comes to possess the nations, we read that in Revelation, under the seventh trumpet, the declaration is made that the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Now, at the second of coming, he takes possession. And again, in 2 Thessalonians, read about, then the wicked shall be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. So again, at the second coming is when Christ takes possession of the nations and destroys the enemies. And so we've got this prophecy that it seems to be disjointed. It's like, from where we're standing, it's like part of it's referring back to what happened in the first century, at the first coming. And then there's this big gap that seems to appear, and the other part of it's presented way in the future. And so it seems like the prophecy is disjointed, like we're looking in two different directions for the fulfillment of the one prophecy. And this seemingly disjointed nature of the prophecy has led to different prophetic interpretations, not just in this verse particularly, but in general in scripture, to solve some of this disjointed nature that prophecy appears to have sometimes. What some people tend to do is they try to take all of it and try to sort of put it in the past and say it was all fulfilled back then. Okay, but in order to do that, they have to say, well, those verses don't apply to the second coming. They don't apply to the Messiah. It's actually not the Messiah that is this king rising and that is conquering. And they try to apply it to a different king in the past. Whether it be, maybe David was the king that rose out of Israel and he conquered these nations. Okay, that's called like a preterist view. They try to take everything and put it in the past to try to keep it all together as a package. The other view, where they try to take it all and try to throw it all in the future. And again, it means it takes it away from applying it to Christ, saying that these things can't refer to him as his first coming, and throws it all in the future and saying, at the end, then this other king will arise and all the stuff will happen in Israel and they'll be conquered and there'll be this war and then the end will come. Both these views seek to make sense of the prophecy from where we're standing so they can keep it together as a group. But both of these views fail to do something that I think is very important and key to understanding it. They fail to look at the prophecy from the point of view of the prophet. For example, if I show you this picture, okay, of this mountain range, and I asked you to describe what you saw, you would describe, these trees at the foot of this hill that are some sort of rocky crops with grass covered, and then these big mountains with snow capped rocky mountains in the back, right? And then that's a description of what you're seeing. Okay, now someone who is standing in the middle there might say, well, hold on. There's all this big valley here that he hasn't described. And so to the person standing in that valley, it seems like he's looking in two complete different directions and not able to make sense of this one picture that you've given. But that's because he's not standing in the point of view of the prophet. Okay, the prophet's standing, Balaam is standing at the beginning there, and he's looking forward at the great events of salvation, at sort of the mountain peaks of salvation history, at the first coming of Christ, at the second coming of Christ. And he's describing what he sees in one picture. And then this is the historicism view that takes us from the point of view of the prophet looking forward at these events events unfold throughout history. And so when we have this point of view, the prophecy makes perfect sense. Balaam is looking down throughout the future, describing the mountain peaks of salvation history and what he sees in the events of Christ at his first and second coming. Now, we're going to jump back to the story because I think there's an important lesson to learn when we look at how God's mercy was at play in Matthew 2 and how humanity responded to it. Because we already covered the fact that God took away his leading because he wanted, well, didn't take away his leading. It appeared that he was no longer leading them because that's how he wanted to lead them, to be a witness to his people. And the question is, why did God do that? Because despite Israel repeatedly hardening their hearts, despite them falling into this rigid Pharisaical religion, despite the fact that the shepherds had already borne testimony 2 years earlier that Christ had been born, and his people had largely ignored it. Okay, God's mercy to them still extended. He still wanted them to be, he didn't want them to be left in ignorance. And so in his mercy, he brought the wise man here to be a witness to them again of what was happening. The question is, when God manifested his mercy towards sinful humanity, how did they respond? We pick up the story here in Matthew 2:11. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasure, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. So God warned the wise man, do not go back to Herod. Do not tell him where you found the Christ, because God knew exactly what Herod would do if he found Christ. God knew how Herod would respond. But even though God knew, God still extended his mercy to Herod in testifying to him that Christ had been born, that the Messiah was here. And it carries on. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt. So again, God warned Joseph. He knew that now that Herod didn't know who Christ was because the wise men had left, that he would just seek vengeance upon all of the children. So he said, leave that, go into Egypt, flee from Herod, because he will seek to destroy all the children. God knew what would happen. And of course, then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, and exceedingly wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and in all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Why did this happen? You know, God could have led the wise men straight there. He could have not taken away his star. They would have gone straight to Bethlehem, worshipped Christ, and returned home. And Herod would have never known. Herod would have never came there and slaughtered all these innocent. All these innocent people were slaughtered. Why? Because God showed mercy to humanity. God manifested mercy towards Herod, the children of Israel, the chief priests. He manifested mercy towards them and not leaving them in darkness and ignorance. But when that light shone upon them, Herod loved the darkness. He wished to stay in darkness. He wished to stamp out that light. All these children died because God showed mercy to humanity. And we chose the darkness rather than light and rejected his mercy. This was humans' response to God's mercy. And we don't see it just here, but throughout the life of Christ, we see God constantly extending mercy and forgiveness to humanity. And that ended up with them chanting, crucify him, crucify him. Because that is human nature. That is what God is dealing with. And to all the sufferings we see around the world, all these things that happen, is because God is trying to be merciful to a race of stubborn, rebellious sinners, who, when the light is shone upon us, we fight to keep in darkness. That is what is happening here. That is why these innocents died. That is why there is so much suffering in the world. Because men choose darkness over the God who reveals light. Now, carrying on the story, that there are two scriptures that Matthew quotes as being fulfilled in this story. And we find the first one here in verse 14 and 15. We read, and when he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I have called my son. Now, this is a verse from Hosea, and we're going to look there in Hosea chapter 11 soon. But I just want to notice it's referring back to the Exodus, where, God was calling his people to come out of Egypt, calling Israel, his firstborn, as he called him, to come out of Egypt, calling Israel out of Egypt, to save them from Egyptian bondage. Now, if you notice a lot of parallels. Pharaoh had all the children killed, same as Herod had the children killed. But God had chosen a person who would deliver his people. And Moses was saved from that and was raised up to deliver his people from this Egyptian bondage. Christ was saved from this to deliver God's people from bondage. But the thing that stood out to me that I didn't see for a long time is Matthew's quoting what happened here as fulfillment, that God has called his son out of Egypt. But when this is fulfilled, what direction is Christ going? What direction is Joseph and Mary taking Jesus? They're actually leaving Israel to go into Egypt. And Matthew's quoting this as fulfillment of this, because Israel has become the new Egypt. God's people are become the new house of bondage. And so in order to save them from Egypt, he's taken them out of Israel and going to literal Egypt. And so at the time here, God's people, God's church is the place of Egyptian bondage that Christ is to come and save us from. That's a very sobering, a solemn thought there. Now, we're going to jump back to the book of Hosea. Like I said, this verse is taken from Hosea chapter 11, but we're going to jump into a few verses before that in chapter 10 and to look at what is the prophet leading up to in this prophecy. What is he coming? What is the context that Matthew is quoting from? So it starts out here in Hosea chapter 10, in verse 11. He says, I will make Ephraim to ride, and Judah shall plow, and Jacob shall break his clods. Sow to yourself in righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, till he come and rain righteousness upon you. So God is calling out to his people, to Ephraim and Judah, to all the tribes of Israel, to come to sow in righteousness, to reap mercy, and God will rain righteousness. This is the call that is going out to them. This is what God's wanting of his people. But what is the reality? He carries on. You have plowed wickedness. You have reaped iniquity. You have eaten the fruit of lies, because thou didst trust in thy ways, in the multitude of the mighty man. Therefore shall a turmoil arise among thy people, and all the fortresses shall be spoiled. So he speaks of what he wants from them, to sow in righteousness and to reap mercy. But instead, the reality that he gets is they plow in wickedness and reap iniquity. This is what he's dealing with, this constant call for his people to come to righteousness, but their constant backsliding into iniquity. And then we open chapter 11 with this verse. When Israel was my child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. As they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed unto Balaam. They burned incense to graven images. I taught Ephraim also to go, taking them by their arms, but they knew not that I healed them. And so God is again dealing with his people. He's saying, I've called them to righteousness, but they choose iniquity. I saved them from Egypt, and they still went back into bondage. It's interesting, he called them out of Egypt, but it's like he's highlighting the problem, that Egypt wasn't the issue. Egypt wasn't the enemy. And Matthew has that same problem in quoting this, because he's saying Israel is the new Egypt. Egypt wasn't the enemy was something else, because now Israel is Egypt. When God called them out of Egypt, they turned back to worship images, to sacrifice to Baal. It's interesting if we carry on. It says, he shall not return into the land of Egypt, but the Assyrian shall be his king. And so it carries on talking about the next captivity that would happen to them. Now you've got Egypt, this king in the south, and Assyria would be the king to the north. And as we're going to see when we look at the second verse Matthew quotes in Jeremiah, that this Assyrian captivity and the Babylonian captivity are sort of mixed into one. It's almost seen as the same captivity, but in two different phases. Because both the Assyrians, who was the nation to the north, the kingdom of the north, and the Babylonians, who then conquered the Assyrians and came in with armies from the north. The Assyrians and the Babylonians are both the kingdoms to the north that would come and take Israel into captivity. And so God saved people, his people, from the kingdom of the south. He saved them from Egypt. But Egypt wasn't the problem, because they continued to rebel. And then they were taken captive into the kingdoms of the north, into Assyria and then Babylon. He carries on talking about their rebellion, because they refused to return. And the sword shall abide on his cities, and shall consume his branches and devour them, because of their own counsel. And my people are bent to backsliding from me. Though they call them to the Most High, none at all would exalt him. They would refuse to worship God and to exalt him. And so the first verse Matthew quotes identifies Israel as the new place of Egyptian slavery that God's people are in. and that Christ is called to save them from. And it's interesting, the verse that he quotes transitions from the Egyptian slavery, and because they refuse to repent, they end up in the captivity to the northern kingdoms. And jumping back into Matthew, the second verse that Matthew quotes, here in verse 17, we read, "Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and would not be comforted because they are not." He's saying this is the verse that was fulfilled with what Herod did there. But again, he's quoting from the Old Testament. He's quoting from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, which is dealing with the Babylonian captivity. When God's people were taken into exile in Babylon, when the people were taken away. That's what this verse is referring to back then. So not only does he quote the verse referring to the Exodus as saying Israel was the new place of Egyptian slavery, he's now saying that the church, Israel, was the new place of Babylonian captivity. Now, we're going to jump back to Jeremiah and start in chapter 30, verse 1, to look at the context again of this quote, where he's bringing it from. It starts off in chapter 30, verse 1. "The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord God of Israel, saying, Write thee all the words that I have spoken unto thee in a book. For lo, the day come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it." And so in this section, in this chapters 30 and 31, okay, Jeremiah is told to write this section in a book, this prophecy, that he will again bring again the captives of his people. He's talking about returning the captives that were taken to Babylon. And as part of this, there's prophecies that God's giving about returning that captivity. When we get to chapter 31, verse 15, we read this: "Thus saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentations and bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children because they were not." Again, this is what Matthew quotes, that this weeping and lamentation for those that were killed in the siege, that were taken captives, that are gone, that are no longer there. Okay, weeping and refusing to be comforted. But this prophecy that Jeremiah is giving carries on. And this is the experience of the people in this Babylonian captivity, the experience that Matthew says is being fulfilled in God's church, in God's people of the day. But it carries on. "Thus saith the Lord, refrain thy voice from weeping, and thine eyes from tears, for thy work shall be rewarded, saith the Lord. And they shall come again from the land of the enemy. And there is hope in thine end, saith the Lord, that thy children shall come again to their own borders." And so there's this weeping and lamentation going on. The captivity has happened, that the people are taken, and they're refusing to be comforted. But God comes and speaks words to comfort to his people in that stage, that they will again be brought again. And this is what's happening here, that the promise that they'll be brought again, whether at the end of the 70 years or in the resurrection, they will be brought again. That they are not gone forever. All is not lost. God has not left us without hope. But it carries on. "Surely I have heard Ephraim bemoan himself thus. Thou hast chastised me, and I was chastened." Now, when we looked at Hosea, and it talked about the going from the Egyptian bondage to the Assyrian captivity, I mentioned that the Assyrians and the Babylonian captivity is sort of seen as the one captivity in two phases, because it's both these kingdoms of the north that are coming to lead them into captivity. And when Babylon came to captive, they had already assimilated Assyria as part of their empire. That was their kingdom. And so now here, when Jeremiah is prophesying after the Babylonian captivity about returning that, he mentions Ephraim, who was taken captive by the Assyrians. And so here, when God's speaking about returning the Babylonian captivity, he's actually including the Assyrian captivity and all of Israel in this And it carries on. Is Ephraim my dear son? Is he a pleasant child? For since I spake against him, I do earnestly remember him still. Therefore my bowels are troubled for him. I will surely have mercy upon him, saith the Lord. So it speaks again about God wanting to return this captivity, about having mercy and bringing his people in. So to run this through, there's God's people being taken into captivity. There's been weeping and mourning. God's saying he would restore them. He would deliver them from the Babylonian captivity and again bring them home. But then in chapter 31, he speaks of another deliverance that needs to happen. Because as we said, he saved them from Egypt, but Egypt wasn't the real enemy because God's people have now become Egypt. He saved them from the Babylonian captivity, but Babylon wasn't the real enemy because God's people are now experiencing the Babylonian captivity in their own country, in their own land, among their own people. And here again, he's saying he will return the captivity, but there is another deliverance that needs to happen. And so we carry on reading in chapter 31 and we read this. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them from by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband unto them, saith the Lord. So here, he's looking back at Egypt, saying, I brought them out of Egypt, okay? And I've just talked about bringing them back out of Babylon, returning the captivity. But there is another deliverance that has to happen. There is a day that will come when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. And I will defeat the actual enemy. And he says in that new covenant, he says, I'll put my laws in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. See, this is the problem with the previous deliverance. It just dealt with taking the people out of Egypt, taking the people back from Babylon. But they weren't the problem. The problem, what was in the people's hearts and minds. And so here we have him presenting that final solution, the defeat of the final enemy, the final deliverance that is needed here to make the change in God's people. This is the passage that Matthew is quoting from. And so when we see that, not only is Matthew quoting the text from Hosea and Jeremiah to say that God's people, like Israel, the church of God, was now the place of Egyptian slavery. It was now the place of the Babylonian captivity. It also highlights the point that Egypt and Babylon were never the real enemy. And that God's deliverance from Egypt and his deliverance from Babylon didn't change them, but Christ now would. He has come to make a greater deliverance. He has come to fight against the real enemy. And this is what this prophecy in Jeremiah points to. To jump back a little earlier in Jeremiah chapter 16, we have this verse that I find kind of interesting. He's speaking to them, he says, therefore, behold, the day comes, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord liveth, that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But the Lord liveth, that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north. It's both Assyria and Babylon, of those kings of the north. And from all the lands whither he had driven them, and I will bring them again into their land that I gave unto them and their fathers. So he's talking about there was this great deliverance that came out of Egypt. And since that happened, God's people always, it says they swore by the Lord liveth that brought us out of Egypt. And he's saying that what's going to happen next in Babylon is going to be so terrible. And God's going to do another great deliverance, a greater deliverance. That you're no longer going to talk about how God saved you from Egypt. You're now going to talk about how God saved you from Babylon, from the kingdoms of the north, from your captivity, and brought you back home. And what Matthew's highlighting, and what we saw there in Jeremiah 31, is that there is another deliverance that's going to happen. And that deliverance will be so great that when it happens, they're no longer going to say, the Lord lives that brought us out of Egypt, or the Lord lives that brought us out of Babylon. But the Lord lives that saved us from our sins. That is this final deliverance that Christ has come to bring. And that's why Matthew quotes both these verses as being fulfilled. That as Christ was come, born King of the Jews, born to rule over his people, who would deliver them from the real enemy. Not the literal Egypt, but the spiritual Egypt and the captivity that they are experiencing, and the captivity of Babylon that they are experiencing among their own people. But this would be the final deliverance, that Christ comes to save them from the real enemy. And so when we look at what we've covered in the book of Matthew so far, as we've looked at the genesis of Jesus, we saw at the beginning of the genealogy that God took his people from Babylon up to the promises being fulfilled in David. Then they fell back to Babylon. And now they're presented with Jesus as the new David, the new fulfillment of all those messianic prophecies, the true king that sits on the throne of David. And that left us with the question, what do we do with Jesus? Then the next story in the genesis of Jesus is his origin, his incarnational origin, where he's presented as Emmanuel, God with us, and the one who would save his people from their sins. And now, in the wise men, present him as the one born King of the Jews, highlighting his messianic origins and his mission to deliver his people from the real slavery that we experience and the real captivity that we are suffering under. And so we have his human origin, we have his incarnational origin, we have his messianic origin. And next time, we're going to look at the baptism of Christ, where the voice of God speaks for earth and gives us his heavenly origin.